I had worked that patch of land for over 10 years, 35 acres of mixed pine and oak forest that bordered a small lake on one side and the edge of the Maple Ridge subdivision on the other. It was my pride, my livelihood, and my retreat. I wasn't some absentee landowner. I spent weekends cutting, maintaining trails, and harvesting fallen timber. Last winter had been brutal, and a storm had taken down dozens of mature trees, mostly red oak and hickory. I carefully cleared the downed logs, trimmed, stacked, and prepped them for sale. Timber prices were high that year, and the lot was worth close to $38,000 at market rate, a decent return for the effort I had poured in. I stored everything neatly on my side of the property, behind a locked gate, marked by private property signs I'd installed every 50 feet along the border. Everything about that land was legal, documented, and well within my rights. Then came the day that changed everything. It was early March when I first noticed something was wrong. The lock on my gate was broken. Not just cut, completely removed and replaced with another padlock that wasn't mine. My heart sank immediately. I could see fresh tire tracks in the mud leading down the access path, the kind only heavy machinery made. I climbed over the gate, following the deep tracks toward my logging area. The sight that greeted me was infuriating. The logs, every single one of them, were gone. My entire timber pile had vanished. What had taken me months to cut, prepare, and sort had disappeared overnight. At first, I thought it might have been thieves or illegal loggers, something that occasionally happened in remote areas. But as I traced the tire marks and saw how neatly everything had been loaded, I knew it was an organized operation. Then I noticed something else, an HOA truck. Parked half a mile down the hill near their community maintenance area, there sat one of their vehicles with mud caked on the tires. The logo of Maple Ridge HOA was printed on the door. I couldn't believe it at first. Why would the Homeowners Association of a neighborhood I wasn't even part of be on my property, let alone stealing timber? The next morning, I went straight to the HOA office. The president, a sharp-tongued woman named Karen Whitfield, met me in the lobby. She had that smug air of authority, the kind of person who believed her clipboard gave her power over everyone in a 10-mile radius. When I calmly asked about my logs, her response was astonishing. Those logs were on HOA-managed land, she said, without even blinking. We had to clear debris for the safety of our residents. I was speechless. I pulled out a copy of my land deed, showing her the exact boundaries clearly marked and recorded with the county. Her expression faltered for a second, but then she doubled down. Well, those logs were blocking our access road. We had every right to remove them, she snapped. I corrected her. There was no access road. The path they used was an old service trail entirely within my property line. Over the next few days, I tried to get the logs back, or at least get compensation. I contacted the logging company that had done the removal. After some digging, I discovered the HOA had sold the timber to a local mill under their name. They didn't just move it, they profited from it. The invoice showed a sale totaling $38,247. When I confronted Karen again with the evidence, she didn't apologize or even look guilty. Instead, she accused me of theft. "You're lucky we don't press charges," she sneered. "Those logs were on HOA property, and your sudden claim sounds suspicious." It was infuriating. She called the county sheriff and told him I had trespassed onto HOA land, cut down trees, and stolen community timber for personal gain. I was stunned when deputies actually came to my door that afternoon to question me. Thankfully, I had all my paperwork ready. I provided land surveys, photos, timestamps, and drone footage from before the theft showing the logs neatly stacked well within my property. The deputy's expression told me he knew something was off. Still, the HOA wouldn't back down. Karen even went as far as posting a notice on their neighborhood bulletin, warning residents about a man claiming ownership of HOA resources. The nerve of that woman was unbelievable. At that point, I knew reasoning with her was pointless. She thrived on control and confrontation. So I turned to the legal system. I hired an attorney who specialized in land disputes. After showing him the evidence, deeds, property maps, logging contracts, and the mill's purchase record, he told me I had an airtight case. We filed a civil suit against the HOA for trespassing, theft, destruction of property, and defamation. I also notified the county assessor's office and the local forestry department to ensure there were no misunderstandings about land boundaries. As soon as the HOA was served with papers, the tone changed. Karen called me personally, her voice suddenly sweet and apologetic. "We can resolve this privately," she suggested. "No need to involve courts. We'll offer you $5,000 for the inconvenience. I laughed outright. You stole $38,000 worth of timber and tried to frame me for it, I said. We're well past the point of handshakes and coffee meetings. She hung up on me. What followed was months of escalating tension. HOA board members tried to intimidate me. They parked near my gate, took pictures of my land, and sent letters accusing me of environmental violations. One board member even confronted me at a grocery store, calling me a scammer and threatening to make sure the whole town knew who I really was. But what they didn't realize was that every one of those actions just strengthened my case. I documented everything, every threat, every photo, every word. By summer, my lawsuit was in full swing and depositions were underway. My attorney uncovered internal HOA emails revealing that Karen had known about the land boundary all along. She had even acknowledged in one email that the logs technically sit on his land, but she went ahead with the removal anyway to avoid delay with the new walking trail project. That email would later become the nail in her coffin. But as the case built momentum, the HOA didn't go down quietly. They launched a smear campaign trying to discredit me in court and in the community. They claimed I'd forged land documents, falsified boundary lines, and interfered with HOA development plans. Yet the truth was on my side, and I wasn't about to let them rewrite it. By the time the case reached the county courthouse, the HOA had already transformed a simple act of theft into a full-blown war. Their lawyers came out swinging, backed by the association's deep pockets and a smug belief that a regular landowner like me wouldn't stand a chance against their machine. But what they didn't realize was that I had been preparing for this moment for months. Every photo, document, witness, and timestamp was carefully cataloged. My attorney, Mark Dawson, was sharp, relentless, and had a reputation for dismantling HOAs that overstepped their bounds. We walked into that courtroom knowing the truth was on our side and the evidence was irrefutable. The HOA's lead counsel opened the case with confidence, painting me as a rogue landowner who had illegally encroached on community property. They claimed I'd harvested timber from HOA-managed green space and tried to sell it for profit. Their story was slick, filled with fabricated details and technical jargon. They even produced a map showing the disputed area as HOA property, except, as my attorney pointed out later, the map was self-created, never registered with the county, and riddled with inaccuracies. The HOA's entire argument rested on that doctored document. When it was our turn, Mark stood and addressed the court calmly. "Your Honor," he began, "the defendants have fabricated an entire narrative to cover up a calculated act of theft." He submitted our evidence, certified property maps from the county recorder, dated photos showing my private property signs, the timber logs tagged with my lot number, and, most damningly, the invoice from the mill proving the HOA sold the wood under their own name. The judge leaned forward, clearly intrigued. "You're telling me," he asked, "the HOA sold this timber and kept the money?" Mark nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. And they did it after knowingly trespassing onto private land. Then came the witness testimonies. The logging company manager, a man named Tom Harris, took the stand first. He testified that it was the HOA president herself, Karen Whitfield, who signed the order authorizing removal and sale of the timber. He explained that the HOA provided access keys and a map, claiming ownership of the property. When asked whether he had confirmed that ownership, Tom admitted, "No, Your Honor. We trusted the HOA's word because they presented themselves as the legal land managers." That admission hit hard. It showed not only negligence but also deceit. Karen's turn on the stand was explosive. Dressed in her pristine white blazer, she tried to maintain composure, but the cracks began showing almost immediately. My attorney questioned her about the email chain we'd discovered, the one where she acknowledged that the logs technically sit on his land. Her face went pale. "I don't recall writing that," she said. Mark handed her a printed copy. "Is that your email address? Is that your name on the signature line?" he asked. She hesitated, glancing nervously toward her lawyer. "Yes," she finally admitted. But it was a misunderstanding. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge raised a hand for silence, but the damage was done. Mark pressed further. "So you admit you were aware the logs were on my client's land?" Karen squirmed. "We believe the boundary lines were flexible," she stammered. "Flexible?" Mark repeated. "Property lines are not flexible, Ms. Whitfield. You knowingly ordered your team to remove material worth over $38,000 from private land. Then you sold it and accused my client of theft. That's not flexibility. That's fraud. Karen looked furious but had no response. Over the next few hours, the HOA's entire case unraveled. Their supposed surveyor admitted he wasn't licensed. Their mapmaker confessed he had adjusted boundary lines at Karen's direction to match HOA plans. Even one of the board members turned against her, testifying that Karen had bragged during a meeting about teaching that stubborn landowner a lesson after I refused to let the HOA expand their walking trail through my property. That revelation caused an audible gasp across the courtroom. It became clear that this wasn't just a boundary mistake, it was retaliation. The defense tried one last tactic. They claimed I had exaggerated the timber's value. But Mark was ready for that too. He brought in a certified forestry appraiser who explained that the species, size, and quantity of logs were worth exactly $38,247 at current market rates. He even had photos and sale records from the same mill the HOA had used. The judge nodded, visibly impressed by the thoroughness of our case. Karen's composure deteriorated as the evidence piled up. At one point, she blurted out that the HOA was just doing what was best for the community, which drew a sharp rebuke from the judge. "Stealing private property is not a community service, Ms. Whitfield," he said coldly. Her lawyer tried to object, but it was clear the case was slipping away. Every lie, every manipulation, every attempt to bully me had come full circle in that courtroom. When the hearing recessed for lunch, I caught Karen's glare as she walked past me. Her expression was a mix of anger and disbelief, like she couldn't comprehend that her power had finally met resistance. For years, she had gotten away with intimidating residents and bending rules to her will. Now she was facing someone who had the time, resources, and stubbornness to fight back. The second day of trial focused on damages and intent. My attorney demonstrated that the HOA's actions had caused not just financial loss, but emotional distress, defamation, and property damage. We showed photos of the broken gate, torn fencing, and destroyed soil where heavy machinery had trampled my land. The HOA's lawyer tried to argue it was minimal, but even the judge commented that it looked more like a construction site than a conservation effort. Then came the testimony that sealed the case. A local resident, one of the HOA's own members, took the stand. She revealed she'd overheard Karen during a board meeting laughing about how that lumber guy will never figure it out until it's too late. She even had a voice memo of part of the conversation recorded on her phone. When played in court, Karen's voice was unmistakable. "He doesn't deserve that land anyway," she'd said on the tape. "We'll take what we need, and if he complains, we'll call it community property." The entire courtroom went silent. Karen looked mortified, her lawyer buried his face in his hands, and the judge's expression turned icy. By the end of the second day, there was no question who was in the wrong. The HOA's lies had collapsed under the weight of cold, hard evidence. The judge adjourned for the day, but hinted that his ruling would not be favorable to the defendants. As we left the courthouse, I could finally breathe. For months, I'd been painted as a liar, a thief, and an intruder. But now, for the first time, the truth was standing tall, and justice was within reach. Still, I knew it wasn't over yet. Karen wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. The next morning, I'd find out just how far she was willing to go to save herself and how much deeper her corruption really ran. The morning after the second day of trial dawned gray and heavy, as if the sky itself anticipated another storm. I arrived at the courthouse early, coffee in hand, determined to see the case through. My lawyer, Mark Dawson, was already there reviewing notes when he gave me a grim look. "They're trying something," he said. "The HOA filed an emergency motion overnight claiming new evidence." My stomach tightened. "What kind of evidence?" I asked. He sighed. "They're alleging that you altered the land markers after the fact to make it look like the logs were on your side of the property." It was outrageous. The idea that I would move steel survey stakes, some embedded 3 feet into the soil, was absurd, but this was Karen's last desperate play. When court resumed, the HOA's attorney strode in with newfound arrogance, holding a series of photographs. "Your Honor," he began dramatically, "these images show freshly disturbed soil and repositioned markers near the disputed boundary line. We believe the plaintiff tampered with property lines after the timber removal to fabricate his claim." The judge raised an eyebrow. Do you have any proof of when these photos were taken? The attorney hesitated, then muttered, Yesterday. That was the moment Mark stood up, his expression ice cold. Yesterday? He repeated. Your Honor, we have documented GPS-tagged photographs taken 8 months ago, showing those exact markers in the same positions as they stand today. He submitted the originals, complete with metadata and timestamp verification. The courtroom's energy shifted immediately. The judge frowned. So, the defendant's new evidence was gathered yesterday during an active lawsuit from the plaintiff's property? Mark nodded. Yes, Your Honor, without permission. A heavy silence fell. The judge's tone turned stern. That sounds like another trespass violation. The HOA's lawyer tried to object, but it was useless. It was yet another self-inflicted wound, and it wouldn't be the last. Later that afternoon, Mark introduced a new witness, a former HOA board treasurer named Ellen Patterson. Nervous but resolute, she took the stand and began recounting her experience working under Karen. She liked to run the HOA like it was her personal kingdom, Ellen said. If anyone questioned her, she'd find ways to humiliate them publicly or force them off the board. She explained how funds were often redirected for community projects that never materialized. When the timber sale money came in, Ellen continued, Karen told us it was to fund the trail expansion, but the money never went into the HOA account. It was transferred to a separate holding account under her personal oversight. Gasps filled the room. The judge's expression hardened as Ellen produced bank statements showing the $38,240 deposit under an account labeled HOA Green Space Fund, which didn't officially exist. That revelation sent the courtroom into chaos. Karen's lawyer asked for a recess, clearly unprepared for this bombshell. When proceedings resumed, Karen looked visibly shaken, her once perfect poise cracking. She avoided eye contact, scribbling notes furiously while her attorney tried to argue the account was legitimate. But Ellen had another surprise, an email from Karen instructing her to transfer the timber proceeds quietly to avoid board scrutiny. When that email appeared on the big screen, the courtroom fell utterly silent. It was clear now this wasn't a mistake, nor a misunderstanding. It was theft, plain and simple. The judge ordered a temporary audit of the HOA's finances, and the results were devastating. Within 48 hours, the county auditor found over $120,000 in unaccounted funds across various unauthorized projects. HOA members in attendance were stunned. Some shouted from the gallery. Others stormed out, furious that their fees had been misused. The case had morphed from a property dispute into a full-scale exposure of corruption. Karen, once feared by her neighborhood, now sat at the defense table pale and trembling. On the third day of trial, things got even worse for the HOA. The local mill owner, called again for testimony, revealed that Karen had personally negotiated the sale price for the timber and received a commission check of $2,000 for administrative assistance. When pressed by my lawyer, he admitted he assumed she was authorized to handle it. I had no idea she wasn't the landowner, he said regretfully. The judge's patience had clearly worn thin. Ms. Whitfield, he said, turning to Karen, did you personally benefit financially from this timber sale? She stammered. It was reimbursement for the paperwork. $2,000 for paperwork? The judge repeated incredulously. This court will determine what that really was. But even as the walls closed in, Karen couldn't help herself. When Mark confronted her about the false public notice she'd posted accusing me of theft, she lashed out. You were a nuisance, she shouted, her voice echoing off the wooden panels. You wouldn't cooperate, you wouldn't allow progress, you think that patch of woods belongs to you, but it's part of a community. I was just trying to make it better. The judge pounded his gavel. Enough, he roared. You will compose yourself, Ms. Whitfield, or you will be held in contempt. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Karen sat down, fuming, muttering under her breath. Her carefully constructed facade had completely collapsed. That night, after the hearing adjourned, I received an anonymous email from a resident in Maple Ridge. It contained photos, scans of old HOA minutes, secret communications, and even invoices, proving that Karen had been using HOA funds to renovate her own property for years. She had used community improvement budgets to landscape her backyard, install a private gazebo, and even repave her driveway. I immediately forwarded everything to my lawyer. The next morning, Mark presented the new evidence to the judge, who allowed it into the record. The courtroom gasped as the photos appeared on the projection screen, Karen posing proudly beside a new stone patio, the receipt clearly stamped with HOA Beautification Fund. At that point, the HOA board began to fracture. Members whispered among themselves, some glaring at Karen, others outright refusing to sit near her. One board member even stood up mid-session and declared, "We withdraw our support for Ms. Whitfield's leadership." The judge allowed the outburst, remarking dryly, "I'd say that's a wise decision." By the end of the third day, the evidence against the HOA, and Karen personally, was overwhelming. My stolen timber was only the beginning of a much deeper web of greed and abuse. The media had caught wind of the story, and local reporters filled the courtroom gallery, snapping photos and jotting notes. Karen's face, once a symbol of neighborhood authority, was now plastered across headlines. HOA president accused of embezzlement and timber theft. When court adjourned that evening, Mark turned to me with a small smile. "They've lost," he said simply. "Tomorrow it's just about how much they'll have to pay." I nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and disbelief. Months of stress, humiliation, and legal warfare were finally coming to a head. For the first time since the ordeal began, I felt a genuine sense of victory. Not just for me, but for everyone Karen had bullied and silenced over the years. Yet deep down, I knew she wouldn't go quietly. People like Karen never did. And as the final day of court loomed, I could sense she was planning one last, desperate move to save herself from the judgment that was about to crush her empire. The final morning of the trial carried an eerie calm, the kind that comes right before a thunderstorm. I barely slept the night before, replaying every moment of the last few months in my head, the broken gate, the missing logs, the humiliation of being called a thief. Now, everything hinged on this last day. My lawyer, Mark Dawson, was already in the courthouse lobby when I arrived. He handed me a coffee and said, "This is it, my friend. Today, the truth finishes what it started." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Reporters filled the benches, the HOA members whispered among themselves, and Karen Whitfield sat at the defense table looking like a porcelain statue about to crack. Her pristine white suit, once a symbol of authority, now seemed like a desperate shield. She refused to make eye contact with me. Her lawyer kept his face buried in notes, clearly aware of how badly the case had gone. The judge entered precisely at 9, the sound of his gavel slicing through the murmurs. "Court is now in session," he said firmly. "We will proceed with closing statements before rendering judgment." Karen's attorney stood first, clearly trying to regain some semblance of control. His voice was slick, but his argument was hollow. "Your Honor," he began, "while my client may have made administrative oversights, she did so with the community's best interests at heart. The property lines in question were never clearly marked, and the removal of the timber was part of a broader initiative to maintain community safety. This was not theft. It was a misunderstanding born of poor communication." His speech dragged on, filled with legal buzzwords and desperate spin, but the judge's stony expression didn't change once. When he finished, Mark stood and stepped forward, calm but commanding. "Your Honor," he began, "we've heard a lot about misunderstandings, good intentions, and supposed community service. But let's call this what it truly was: theft, fraud, and abuse of power. The defendant didn't act out of confusion. She acted out of entitlement. She took something that wasn't hers, lied about it, and tried to destroy the man she stole from when he dared to stand up to her." He turned briefly to the jury box, then back to the judge. "We've presented proof beyond dispute, documents, maps, testimony, and even her own emails, that this was a deliberate scheme. The HOA's so-called community project was nothing but a front for personal gain. This isn't just about timber, Your Honor. It's about accountability." The judge nodded slowly, then looked directly at Karen. "Ms. Whitfield," he said, his tone grave, "please stand." The room went silent as she rose. The judge continued, "This court has spent considerable time reviewing the evidence and listening to testimony. What I see is not an administrative error. What I see is a pattern of deceit, manipulation, and disregard for the law. You trespassed on private property, stole valuable timber, sold it for profit, and then falsely accused the rightful owner of theft." Karen's face was pale, but she lifted her chin defiantly. Your Honor, The judge cut her off sharply. Silence. You've had your chance to speak. He turned to the clerk. The court finds in favor of the plaintiff. He paused to let the words sink in. The Maple Ridge Homeowners Association, under the direction of Ms. Karen Whitfield, is hereby ordered to pay full restitution of $38,247 for the stolen timber, $75,000 in punitive damages for malicious conduct, and $30,000 for defamation and property damage. Furthermore, he added, looking directly at her, this court recommends that the evidence of embezzlement and falsified records be forwarded to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution. The gavel struck once, echoing like thunder. For a moment, the courtroom was frozen in silence. Then a ripple of murmurs broke out, reporters whispering, cameras flashing, HOA members shaking their heads in disbelief. Karen's lawyer slumped back into his seat, defeated. But Karen, true to her nature, couldn't accept it quietly. This isn't over, she shouted suddenly, slamming her palms on the table. You're all blind. That land should have been ours. He's lying. The judge banged his gavel again. Bailiff, remove Ms. Whitfield from the courtroom, he ordered. 2 officers approached, and though she resisted, they guided her out, her protests echoing down the corridor. As the doors closed behind her, the tension that had gripped the courtroom for days finally lifted. Mark turned to me with a faint smile. We did it, he said simply. I nodded, though the reality of it hadn't yet sunk in. After so long being accused and slandered, hearing those words, we did it, felt surreal. Reporters rushed toward us the moment we stepped outside. Cameras flashed as one of them asked, "How does it feel to take down the HOA?" I paused, choosing my words carefully. This wasn't about taking anyone down, I said. It was about standing up for what's right. No one, no matter how powerful, should be allowed to take what isn't theirs. The next few weeks brought more fallout than I'd imagined. The Maple Ridge HOA was placed under county supervision, its accounts frozen pending audit. Several board members resigned, claiming they'd been coerced by Karen's leadership. The residents of Maple Ridge voted to dissolve the old board entirely and rebuild from scratch with transparency and oversight. Karen herself faced criminal charges for embezzlement and falsifying public records. She eventually took a plea deal, no prison time, but a hefty restitution payment and a lifetime ban from holding any leadership position within an HOA. The local paper ran the headline, HOA President Toppled After Timber Theft Scandal. As for me, I finally had peace. With the settlement money, I repaired the damage they'd done to my land, replacing the crushed soil and rebuilding the gate that had been broken during the theft. I replanted trees where the old ones had been taken, oak, pine, and maple, the same kinds that once stood tall before greed cut them down. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about restoration, about putting things right. I even put up a new sign at the entrance, "Private property, respect boundaries." It wasn't a warning. It was a statement of balance, a reminder that respect for ownership and honesty should never be optional. Months later, I received a letter from a Maple Ridge resident. It wasn't long, just a simple note that read, "Thank you for standing up. You didn't just protect your land, you freed our neighborhood." That single sentence meant more to me than the entire settlement. Because in a strange way, the battle that started with stolen logs ended up changing an entire community. One autumn evening, I walked the perimeter of my land, the golden sunlight streaming through the young trees I'd planted. The air was quiet except for the rustling of leaves and the distant call of birds. I stopped by the lake, the reflection of the woods dancing across the still water, and felt a peace I hadn't known in years. The land was mine again, not just by deed, but by justice. Karen had tried to steal wood, but what she really tried to take was dignity. And in the end, that was what she lost the most. The community she once ruled now whispered her name only as a warning, a reminder of what happens when greed replaces decency. I smiled as I turned to leave the water's edge. The fight was over, but the lesson would last forever. Power doesn't make you right. Truth does. And when the truth finally stands tall, no amount of corruption can cut it down.